Hello, and welcome to our series on sectionalism and the Civil War. Today we're going to examine how the expansion of slavery increased political tension during the time of the Civil War. Southern politicians sought to defend slavery by retaining control of the federal government. They did this by attempting to make sure that there were more slave states than free states in the United States, because if there were an equal number, or if there were more free states than slave states, slavery could be made illegal in Congress. The South was devoted to an agrarian plantation economy based on the necessity of slavery. Because of the way that cotton was grown, it was quote unquote necessary for the plantation system to rely on slave labor. Northern abolitionists published newspapers and held meetings to further their cause. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, brought to life the horrors of slavery, which were disputed by Southern proponents of slavery. So, again, people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison are all arguing that slavery is wrong, and the South is saying, but wait a minute, no, it's not. Classic. So let's talk about slavery in the North. So by 1804, slavery had been outlawed by all states north of the Ohio River. Abolitionist societies, newspapers, and the Underground Railroad developed to advocate outlawing slavery. So again, they're forming societies to say that slavery is wrong. People are escaping via the Underground Railroad, especially via Harriet Tubman. And they're forming these groups to say that slavery is bad and we're not going to tolerate it anymore. Let's talk a little bit more about the North. So in the North, an expanding railroad system and industrialization results in many large factories. As a result, many people move to cities to work in the factories. The factories are successful only if they have cotton from the South. There are some Northerners who believe that slavery is wrong, and they're called abolitionists. It's very different in the South. In the South, enslaved people were viewed as labor and property. Slavery was considered a states' rights issue. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 allowed Southern slaveholders to capture enslaved people who had escaped to the North. So again, people would go into the North, capture people who had run away, and drag them back to the South. Sometimes the people that they dragged away weren't even really runaway slaves. They just happened to be black. Let's talk about the South and the West. So the South is mainly agricultural, and they have a lot of small farms and plantations. The cotton gin increased the value of growing cotton, which creates the need for more slaves. Both the South and the West focus on agriculture or farming, but people in Western territories also mined for gold and other natural resources. Let's talk about some political decisions that affected slaves and free blacks during this era. So those include the Missouri Compromise. Again, the Missouri Compromise is where Missouri entered the Union as a slave state and Maine entered as a free state. This compromise also stated that all states north of the 3630 line of latitude that entered the Union would be free states, which worked until 1850 when we got all that land from the Mexican Cession. And so in 1850, they came up with another compromise. So California was admitted to the Union as a free state, the slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C., and stronger slavery laws are passed to help Southerners capture runaway enslaved people. Again, that's the Fugitive Slave Act. So California comes in as free, yay! You can't sell slaves in Washington, D.C., yay! But the Fugitive Slave Act says that slaveholders can come into any state they want and capture runaway slaves. And let's take a look with your notes. So again, California joins as a free state. The South doesn't like it. Henry Clay creates the Compromise of 1850 that lets California enter as a free state and passes a tighter fugitive slave law to make the South happy. The fugitive slave law allows Southerners to hunt down escaped slaves. In the West, fighting broke out in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed both Kansas and Nebraska to use popular sovereignty, voting, to decide if they wanted to be free or slave states. Senator Stephen Douglas convinced Congress to pass a law that allowed people within a territory to vote on the issue of slavery. As a result, thousands both for and against slavery moved to Kansas in order to influence the vote. Violence erupted between the two groups in what came to be called Bleeding Kansas. We next need to talk about a court case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. So enslaved people were considered property and were denied citizenship. The decision made the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional because it limited areas allowed for slavery. The South favors the decision, but the North does not, and it caused further tension between the North and the South. Let's talk a little bit about who Dred Scott was. So, Dred Scott was a slave who was taken by his owner to the North, then back to the South. He sued for his freedom because he was on free ground at one point. And then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court said two things. One, slaves of African descent are not citizens and cannot sue. Two, slaves are property and the government had no right to take property away from its citizens. Therefore, the government will allow slavery to spread. And this was devastating. It took all citizenship rights away from African Americans. We need to talk briefly about economic factors. Economic factors depended on geographic location. So in the South, the plantation system continued to rely on slavery. Enslaved people could not own property and had no rights. In the North, the slave trade was abolished and free African Americans could own property, but they still could not vote, serve on juries, or testify in court. Socially, racism existed for both groups of enslaved people and free blacks. Slaves were considered property in the South. In the North, free blacks could not vote. They could not gather in groups of more than two. They could not serve on juries, and they were socially segregated. So even though they were free, there was still a high degree of segregation. Let's sum it up quickly. So economic differences between the North and South led to political tension. They temporarily tried to solve the issue with compromises. The Dred Scott decision denied citizenship and led to very different lives from African Americans in the North and in the South.